Well, finally, here in biology, we've got a chance to start talking about animals, different kinds of animals. We've got 3 different labs on animals. In the first one, we will be talking about the most evolutionarily ancient forms of animals. As a little perspective, we've got an example here of an animal that is some type of reptile, looks like a horned lizard. And reptiles have an advantage over mammals of the same body weight because they use a lot fewer calories just to stay alive. So in a warm environment where food is limited, reptiles have an advantage over, say, a mouse of the same body mass. Also, blue whales, they're making a comeback now that we've outlawed whaling mostly worldwide. Blue whales are the largest animals that have ever existed, larger than any of the dinosaurs that have ever lived, and they're alive right now. So we're talking about animals and we're talking about diversity. Before we move ahead, let me remind you about the different kingdoms of life. Remember, we had the prokaryotic kingdoms, which were the eubacteria, that's like regular bacteria, like strep throat or E. coli, and the archaebacteria, also more common than you would imagine, but these are the prokaryotes. And then out of all of the eukaryotic kingdoms, we talked about the protistans. We're not going to talk about the funguses, darn. We already talked about the plants. We had 2 labs on plants, and now we've got 3 labs on the animal kingdom. The animal kingdom is, well, what are animals? They're always going to be eukaryotic. They always are multicellular, and they are heterotrophic. The cells of animals are always capable of phagocytosing. So that is one of the ways that makes them different from funguses and plants. Funguses are multicellular, but they cannot do phagocytosis because they've got cell walls. Now, in general, animals digest their food within their bodies, and most of them reproduce sexually. There are exceptions to all of these rules, though. Also, in general, animals develop through a series of developmental stages that zoologists describe as embryology. We did say that plants do have embryos, but those plant embryos are more direct, little tiny itty bitty plants. Animals have got embryos that are very often not related at all to the multicellular animals that develop. Right? The first ones we're going to talk about are the porifera. The porifera is the phylum of the sponges. Make sure that you watch the videos that are embedded into each of these lab activities. They really will enrich your understanding, particularly of these lower levels of life. I think it's very easy for us as mammals that walk around and do stuff to maybe respect things like tigers and giraffes, but have less of an appreciation for these forms of life that we're talking about. So take the time to watch the videos. You'll be glad you did. Something to say about embryology. Embryology is something that animals do, but the other phyla of life don't do. We even see it in a really simple form in the most ancient form of life, the sponge. When animals reproduce sexually, the egg and the sperm come together, they create a fertilized egg called a zygote. And that zygote will go through multiple mitotic stages. So it'll go from one big cell to many, many, many fewer cells. And it's going to end up making a hollow ball of cells. Once it makes that hollow ball of cells, then it almost is like a ghostly finger is like pushing up right there, ghostly finger pushing on up. And when it pushes up, that's going to end up creating this opening. Now that opening is someday going to become the intestinal tract of the animal. We will be talking more about this image, so don't think this is the last time you're going to see it, because as we get further into our discussion, we will be learning about different kinds of intestinal tracts. The sponges are the very first animals we will be talking about. They don't actually have exactly a stomach, but after the sponges, everything has got at least a stomach, a gastric cavity, and most of the things we will be talking about have a complete intestinal tract, which will be a tube that goes through the middle of your body. So, a little bit more about life. There. Okay, a little bit more. So we remember all about plants, right? Um, uh, Earth was here for 4.5 billion years before there was even bacterial life on the planet, and then another 4 billion years before we started getting plants coming up onto the surface of the land. But it was a while ago that we had something called the Cambrian explosion. Um, there was a period of time right here, and people argue about the Cambrian explosion all the time. But there was a period of time, a very short interval in terms of, the story of life, where such an incredible, like just a spectacular diversity of forms of animal life appeared on planet Earth. Now, none of them looked like mammals or dinosaurs or birds or fish. They were all sea creatures, but they had an incredible number of different forms. That Cambrian explosion, most of those forms of life just died out. And only the ones that had the natural selection advantages managed to leave their genetics to become part of the genetics in the forms of life that are still here on planet Earth. Okay. So, oh, I thought I had this fixed. All right. This is going to be the most of the animals that we are going to learn about in these 3 labs. Okay, I can't do it, right? And there are 3 main branching points that are labeled 1, 2, and 3, right? Now, number 1, there was an ancestral protist. Remember the protistans? There was an ancestral protist that first started living not just as a colony of individuals, but a group of individual cells that were related to each other genetically and assigned specific jobs to specific ones of those cells. So, in order to be an animal, the bare minimum for being an animal is to be this guy called the peripherins or the sponges. Now, you probably don't think of a sponge as being alive, right? Definitely not being an animal, but technically they are. And that's for a few reasons. They use the protein collagen, that's an animal protein. They're not just a group of cells, but they're a group of cells that have also divided up the jobs of how to be a part of a sponge. So they've got specialized cells, not quite tissues yet, but specialized cells. And the video is really good about them. Make sure and we're going to talk about that. Okay, so that's the first dividing point. Now, after that, we actually get tissues. Tissues means that all of these animals after this, at least at some point in their lives, they have got muscle and nerve cells and special cells for the digestive tract, right? And they've actually got tissues. So this is the first branching point. The next branching point. The next branching point is going to be, are we going to have radial symmetry or bilateral symmetry? We'll talk some more about that. The third branching point, protostome, deuterostome, I've got to go back to that image that I showed you, and we'll do that when we get to that branching point. There are some other branching points that we will mention. Oh, I guess we'll talk about it now. Okay, why won't this move? There we go. Okay, Symmetry. Animals usually have got bilateral symmetry. Bilateral means that if I want the two sides to be mirror images of each other, all I can do is cut it in half. Bilateral symmetry is like a shovel, right? If I cut the shovel in half, the two sides are kind of matching pieces. But think about a lobster. If I cut it in half, the two sides match. But if I cut it into four pieces, no, that doesn't work. When animals developed bilateral symmetry, it allowed them to develop an area that we would call the head of that animal. The other option to bilateral symmetry was radial symmetry. And lucky for you, there's only one group of animals that has radial symmetry. All right? One group of animals, and they are the cnidarians. The cnidarians are going to be the next ones that we will talk about. Some people think, oh, starfish, this group of animals, wouldn't you say that they have got radial symmetry? And the answer is no, because you can't cut them into four pieces that are all the same. Also, during their larval phase, they still have definite bilateral symmetry. You know what? There are some lab manuals that'll say echinoderms have got bilateral symmetry, that have got radial symmetry. On my quizzes, no. Okay, just the cnidarians. Now, in today's lab, we're going to cover these phyla. Let's go back a second. We're going to be covering the sponges, the cnidarians, the flatworms, and the roundworms. All right. Next week, we're going to do the annelids, the mollusks, and the arthropods. And in the third week, we do the echinoderms and the chordates. All right. So the periphery are the sponges. Make sure you know that. I might show you a picture of a sponge and say, what phylum of animals is this? And the answer is periphery. That's kind of easy to remember, right? Because sponges have got lots of holes in them, and holes are called pores, and periphery means animals with lots of holes in them. The cnidaria, those are the jellyfish and the sea anemones and some really cool things that you will see in the video. And the cnidaria are the ones that have radial symmetry. Then we will do the flatworms. Flatworms are called platyhelminthes. By the way, worm, helminthes, flat, platy, like plate. Like a plate is flat, platyhelminthes are the flatworms. The flatworms include a few things that are parasites to humans, and so we always like talking about these gross things, and we will do that in this lab. And then the nematodes. Nematodes are roundworms. Watch the nematode video, definitely. It talks about how there are like 59 million nematodes for every human on planet Earth, like 59 million. And you pretty much couldn't dig up a tablespoon of soil from your garden without getting lots and lots of nematodes in there. They're just usually very small. Although there's one that is like 27 feet long or something like that. That is absolutely insane. Okay. All righty. Just one second. Okay, let's just talk about body cavities before I end up. One of the things that distinguishes the different types of animals is this thing called body cavities. Now, when we're doing the sponges and the cnidarians, they don't have a body cavity situation at all. What do we mean by a body cavity? What we mean is if you took their body and cut it apart, no. Let me explain it this way. If I put you on the table, hopefully you're anesthetized, and I cut you open, I could open you up, and there's a space inside, and I could pull things out of that space. That space inside of your abdomen or inside of your chest, that is a body cavity. Some of the animals we will be talking about today have no body cavity. Other animals we'll be talking about today have a pseudocoelom, which is a fake body cavity. And then we won't be talking about animals with a true body cavity or a true coelom. And yes, that's pronounced coelom, and I don't know why they spell it that way. Not until next week. All right, see you at the next video when we talk about sponges.